Alright guys, here we go. Welcome. This is the next video lesson. It's like part 2 of yesterday's or of the taxation without representation lesson. Today we're going to talk pretty much exclusively about colonists and their reactions to all of these British policies we talked about yesterday. So, just make sure your notes page is ready to go. And we're going to get started. So the objective today: explain how and why British colonial policy regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. Same as yesterday. Should be easy peasy. Couple of things to notice. I usually, on almost always, try to do a good job of making sure that the key terms are in order, but this week's are not in order. They are a big mess. The last three on the bottom, especially Boston Massacre, they're in just wrong places. So I apologize for that. Just keep that in mind. Big brain question of the day, something I want you to think about while we're doing this. Was the American Revolution and the American War for Independence the same thing? When I say Revolutionary War versus when I say revolution, are they the same thing? Keep that in mind. It'll make more sense in a bit. So let's go ahead and move on and get started. You already know this is the age of protest. We already went over the objective. So let's get into the first key point. All right. So the effort for American independence was energized by colonial leaders such as Benjamin Franklin. You could also throw in like the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, John Adams, as well as popular movements including political activism, laborers, artisans, and women. And we'll get into what they did very shortly. So, moving on. First things first, because we're going to go in order. Got the Boston Massacre. Now, you've probably seen this image before, and this is going to be hard to do in the video, but we're going to try it. If you're on the video and you weren't in the live class today because you're out or what have you, pause me right now for a couple of seconds, take maybe 30 to yourself after I'm done talking, and just look at what you see in the picture. Just think about it. Look at the British guys, look at the colonists. Think about this picture. So pause me now. And hopefully you've already watched and you can bring me back. And some things you should have noticed. Look at the soldiers. They look lined up, right? These guys, they look ready. They look like they were ready to fight. The officers like, fire, giving the order. They're all shooting. And look at these poor, sad colonists, right? There's a dog. Yeah, there's always a dog. Look at them. They're sad. They're upset. The dog looks like he's in danger. The colonists look like a bunch of them were murdered and horribly killed. And what I want you to know, and take it from somebody who loves America and who loves liberty just as much as the next person. This etching, this is silver etching. It looks like a painting because it kind of is, but it was etched in silver by Paul Revere. And then, when you see the painting versions of it and stuff, it's like traced over. But this etching, this silver etching, is a piece of propaganda. It was designed and it was made, with very much the intent of showing the British in a bad light here. In fact, when we get in, we're not going to get into this too much right now, but the soldiers here will be put on trial and they'll be tried by John Adams, who is a future president of the United States and a patriot. And part of why he agrees to set them on trial is because he feels like the events in this painting that were portrayed or in this etching were not exactly as true as what some of the colonists found. The colonists wanted these soldiers executed. They saw this and they thought this is what happened. But let's get into what actually happened, all right? So, at the Boston Massacre. So, it's on March 5th, 1770. A group of colonists gathered around the customs house. And first they're just kind of yelling at troops, insulting them, shouting stuff. Eventually the colonists start to throw snowballs, and the troops are kind of like, whoa, whoa, not cool, not cool. Those snowballs turn to oyster shells, all right? Then they turn to rocks. And a lot of Boston is a coastal town, so all these Bostonians, a lot of them, especially the ones wandering around at night, have these clubs and these sticks, and they look like this picture. And they used them to hit fish, like you'd get a fish up and you'd knock it out, or like to open up oysters, things like that. So they would use these, and they started throwing these at soldiers as well. We don't know who it was, but one of the soldiers fired their gun. Some people say he fell, some people say he dropped the gun. But one shot was fired, and then several others will fire kind of randomly. It'll be like crack, 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 like that. In the end, though, only 5 colonists will end up dead, including Crispus Attucks, who's pictured there, a mixed-race sailor. Crispus Attucks is considered the first death in the American Revolution. And just for your reference, these are Brown Besses. These are the rifles that British redcoats would be using during the time period. So, Boston Massacre happens. It's a whole kerfuffle. The trial that, again, John Adams defended these soldiers. Because his whole thing was, look, people were antagonizing and threatening them, right? And it's this whole issue of, like, the mob doesn't rule us, the laws do, and things like that. So John Adams, one of our future presidents, will defend these guys. They will almost all get off without going to prison. I believe one of them is charged. The rest of them get released. And the British don't forget this, that their troops were treated this way by colonial courts. And, we talked about all the taxes and laws that were put in place later and all the enforcement of all these older laws, right? And that's going to make things get much worse. And that Tea Act will be the last thing standing, right? They repeal the Stamp Act, they repeal the Townshend Acts, they repeal almost everything except the Tea Act, which leads to the Boston Tea Party. Now, it was a protest on a tax on tea. It was one of many political protests done by the Sons of Liberty. During the Boston Tea Party, the Sons of Liberty, who were led by Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams and Paul Revere are the only two named patriots that were at the Boston Tea Party participating. They dumped what would be equivalent of $4 million, I believe, dollars of British tea into the Boston Harbor to protest the tax on tea. I don't know why that says 1, should say 4. This led directly to the passage of the Intolerable Acts, otherwise known as the Coercive Acts. You need to write both. You need to know both. We're going to get into the Coercive Acts right after we talk about the Sons of Liberty again. So if you need time on these, as you should be doing already, right, go ahead and pause. We're going to move forward. So, Sons of Liberty, secret organization, right? They're all over the 13 colonies. Goals are to advance the rights of the colonists. How do they do this? Well, they fight taxation and strict British laws such as Stamp Act, Tea Act. A couple of important members, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, Paul Revere. A couple of guys there you might want to note. Abigail Adams is pictured here. That's a debatable topic. Basically, everything John Adams was involved with, so was Abigail Adams. She's kind of like his unofficial advisor the whole time. So I like to include her, because a lot of the stuff John Adams would have done, it was probably either, if not with the express permission of Abigail Adams, definitely with her knowledge, / some of them might have been her idea. In fact, a few of them probably were. So just keep that in mind. And with that said, if you still need time on Sons of Liberty, go ahead and stop it here, because we're going to move forward and we're going to talk about the Coercive Acts. Or, as they were known, the Intolerable Acts. Why? Because they were so darn intolerable that they had to name them that. So, the Coercive Acts, the Intolerable Acts. There are 4 parts. 4 parts to it that we know about, that are worth talking about. Boston Port Act, which closes the harbor until the colonists paid for the tea they destroyed, which is a whole lot of money. Massachusetts Government Act, this is a big one. It restricted colonial self-government and it prevented town meetings. Massachusetts could no longer have town hall meetings. Third one, Administration of Justice Act. Prevented colonial courts from judging English officials. They all needed to be sent back to England to face justice. Like those soldiers from the Boston Massacre, the ones that were, mostly released. Now that can't happen anymore. Now they're all going back to Britain. And the Quartering Act forced British soldiers to stay in the homes of the colonists. Forced them. And British soldiers, took advantage of this for the most part, almost exclusively. Now, the Intolerable Acts, the Coercive Acts, something to remember and keep in mind about these things. They are very harsh. And now you might be thinking, or maybe you weren't thinking this, maybe you were, well, how is Britain going to enforce these if they're an ocean away? Well, with these acts came 4,000 British troops, British redcoats, to Boston. They landed directly in Boston. They closed the harbor down. They blockaded it. And they started, housing themselves in colonial homes. And they started enforcing all these rules. And then some. So that's how they enforce these laws, the British. And the colonies all start looking around and saying, hey, whoa, you can't do that to Boston. And the king, and England's kind of like, yeah, we can. And they start thinking, well, if they can do that to Massachusetts, what's to stop them from doing it to me here in New York? Or me over here in Georgia? Or me over here in, anywhere else, Maryland? Or New Hampshire? What's to stop them from doing it everywhere? And so the colonists decide to have a meeting. So before we get to this meeting, I want to cover key point 2 so you have it down, and then we can move forward. So, Key point 2. What does key point 2 say? Well, in the face of economic shortages and the British military occupation of some regions, men and women mobilized in large numbers to provide financial support and material support to the Patriot movement. All right, now let's get into the Daughters of Liberty. So there were some Sons of Liberty and there were also Daughters of Liberty. So, again, guys, I can't stress enough, you do not need to get these word per word, but it helps. But what's more important is that you are getting the key bits of info for each one. So, Daughters of Liberty formed in 1765. Protesting the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. Early on, they would protest these by creating their own goods, sewing clothes, finding their own blends of tea with like raspberry leaves and stuff. It was called Liberty Tea, so people could drink it instead of, having to buy for British goods. But as the war broke out, their efforts became more geared towards that. They would melt down metal for bullets. They would sew uniforms. They would do things like that. And it's believed that there was evidence of this happening, or of this being supported by a lot of the men in the cause. Specifically, I found this quote from Samuel Adams from the Sons of Liberty, who said, "With ladies on our side, we can make every Tory tremble." Right? A Tory is like a loyalist, somebody who colonist who's loyal to Britain. And their contributions are very important, and it's some of the first time. It's definitely the first time in American history, but it's one of the first times in general, I should point out, especially to like European, Eurocentric people, that you see women like stepping out and taking an active role in either protest or in war efforts. It's the first time you see it. It won't be the last. It certainly won't be the last. But it's the first time you see it. And like later on when we talk about the effects of this revolution, you're going to see, slowly, I'm not saying it's perfect, but one step at a time, you will see women start to take a more prominent role. They will not be satisfied with just, whatever traditional gender roles will be. And it's important to know, and the Daughters of Liberty are a big part of that. So just keep that in mind as we move forward, and let's talk about the First Continental Congress. So, that's a picture. That's from a TV show called John Adams. That's very good. I think it's on Amazon. It's worth trying. It's worth checking out. Good history. Good stuff. But, so the Intolerable and Coercive Acts happen. And this meeting is a direct result of those acts being passed. Because, again, most of the colonies say, well, if you can do that to Boston, what's to stop them from doing it here? Everybody but Georgia shows up. 12 of the 13 colonies have delegates there. The delegates decide to continue boycotting British goods. They call for the colonies to get their militias ready, quote, at a minute's notice. That's where the term Minutemen comes from, right? Because they were ready at a minute's notice. So, colonies need to get their militias ready. We're going to keep boycotting goods. They also gathered their ideas and petitioned the king. They sent their concerns to him. They were like, hey, king, can you maybe fix this? We'll give you some time. And then the Congress agreed to meet they agreed to meet again in 1775 and kind of see what the king says. Spoilers, the king's not going to be happy, and he's definitely not going to respond to them. At least not positively. So, let's move on. Let's talk real quick what's going to happen next. In 1775. So, there's a couple thousand troops in Boston, and word gets out that they're moving into Massachusetts. Why are the troops moving to Massachusetts? Well, they heard that colonial militias are trying to gather up their guns and their ammo and their arms and their powder, and they're going to, get ready to fight. And they're saying, well, what if we just stop this from happening, right? So the general in charge sends troops down into Lexington and towards Concord to seize powder houses or the armories, like to take the guns, and to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Well, famous patriot Paul Revere, who before this movement was a silversmith, very well known in Boston, he engraved that Boston Massacre piece, rode all night, through the night, to warn the Minutemen and everybody along the way that the British were on their way to Lexington. It's part of why his ride is going to be famous, right? The Midnight Ride, the poem that was made. And so he warned Sam Adams, John Hancock, and others, hey, the British are coming, the British are coming, the British are coming. And the Minutemen are able to get ready. And so they're able to, well, let's talk about what happens next. This is all in 1775, mind you. So this is all pre-declaration, this is pre-Second Continental Congress, this is pre-common sense. The shots heard around the world. You gotta know this. This is super important. This comes up all the time. The battle at Lexington and Concord, the first battle of the Revolutionary War, starts in 1775. Right? Well before there's a Declaration of Independence, well before there's the United States, about 15 months before that. British officials will try to capture colonial arms, right? And capture a couple of leaders. But the Minutemen will intercept these forces at Lexington. Somebody shoots first, we don't know who, and then there's a brief exchange of shots back and forth, and the militia is forced to retreat, and they escape till it's conquered. The British will arrive in Concord. They're looking for leaders. They're looking for ammo and arms, weapons. They can't find any. And while they're looking in the town, the Minutemen are massing outside. They're just getting bigger and bigger forces. And then they will attack. And they start firing on the British, and the British are forced to retreat. And the greatest army in the world, right, the most professional, most trained, proper redcoats, are forced to retreat back to Boston. And they're being chased all the way back up to Boston by colonials. Militias chasing them, shooting at them, doing all sorts of stuff. And part of why is because Lexington, and this is how I always like to personify, right? The British Army is the best in the world at fighting traditional fights, the way you fight in the 18th century. That's what they're good at. Part of why the Americans are able to win this conflict and part of why they're able to win battles is because the Americans don't fight like that. They break the rules. They hide. They use cover. They use buildings and trees. They sneak around. They attack at night. They do things that was like, no, you can't do that. So all the British guys lose in that instance. So at Lexington, I always like to say they met up in a line and they exchanged shots. Well, of course the British are going to win. They're more disciplined. They're better armed, all that stuff. But at Concord, the big groups are actually able to kind of hide around, sneak around, shoot from buildings, like harass the British troops the entire time. And so they're able to retreat. So there you have the shot heard around the world, which basically ultimately ends in a victory for the colonists because the British run all the way back to Boston. And then eventually when Washington gets his army, they will go and they will take Boston. We'll talk more about that next week when we get into the Revolution. So, a couple of things next. Let's talk about common sense. Common sense. So, 1776. Fighting's been going on for a while, but we still don't know, hey, are people going to be independent? Well, an incredibly popular pamphlet by the name of Common Sense, which sold crazy, by the way, it was like the best-selling book of its time, was written, and it helped convince the colonists to support independence, like the general colonists. What this thing did that was special, what this book did, was it was able to take complex, difficult ideas and make them easy for everybody to understand, whether you're educated, whether you're a normal person, because not everybody's educated back then. And I have two quotes here from this pamphlet. You don't have to write these quotes down or anything, but it's just a way for you to kind of see what I mean. Of more worth is one honest man to society in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians who ever lived, right? That's like, and I mean, I even struggled to say it initially, right? But that is a high-minded idea of like regular people are worth more than nobles, right? Crown-wearing kings. And then it got as simple and straightforward as there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. The idea being that tiny Britain can govern giant North America. It's kind of silly. And so he was able to convince a lot of people. Really important. Best-selling author of his time. And lastly, let's talk about the Olive Branch Petition. So this is created by the second, not the first, the Second Continental Congress. And it's a plea. It's like the last attempt to stop the fighting. They're saying, hey, most of us colonists, we're loyal to Britain. We don't want to go to war. We just want to be treated fairly. Like, hey, peace, King George III. And it's the last time that peace will be had. At this same meeting, independence will be declared. And we'll get into why and how next time. So we will talk more. We will start there with the Second Continental Congress declaring independence and the war Tuesday. So let's go on to the exit ticket, which will be in Google Classroom. Basically, here's what you're doing. I put a list of causes of the revolution. You pick the top 3 causes and explain why they're your top 3. So if you're going to put 1, 2, 3, right, name them, then explain them. If you just name them, that's half credit. That's nothing. You don't want that. Name them and explain them. Well, if you pick the proclamation line, you better tell me why. If you pick Boston Tea Party, tell me why. So on and so forth. So pick the 3, top 3. And yes, you got to rank them. 1, 2, 3, these are power rankings. You got to rank them. And then explain why. That's in Google Classroom. Again, if you are out, you need to message me on Teams so I can make sure not to count your stuff late. Because Google Classroom will count it late. So, that is it for me, guys. Have a great rest of your day. I will see you all, or have a great long weekend if you're watching this still on Friday. See you all in class next time.